Good morning. Well, thank you for being here this morning to join the side event on the missing testimonies of Syrian women deprived of liberty. I welcome you on behalf of the organizers, the European Union Delegation and the US mission. We are gathered here to hear the testimonies of Syrian women who have brought to us direct testimonies on the atrocities that have been witnessed since 2011 as a result of the Syrian crisis. And we have these four incredible women to tell us their stories. Before that, I also have the honor of an opening remarks being delivered by Ambassador Stevens, from the head of the European Union Delegation here in Geneva, and also Ambassador Rogers Carstens, the United States Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. Without further ado, I will first give the floor to Ambassador Stevens and later to Ambassador Carstens.
Well, Meskerem, thank you very much. And first of all, a warm welcome to you all to our side event, but especially a warm welcome to the courageous Syrian women that are here to share their testimonies of what happens and what happens to them in Syria. And I must say, the figures, the numbers are simply striking. There are about 215,000 detainees in Syria, in Syrian prisons. I mean, on more of half of them, we have absolutely no news. We don't know what happened with them, if they are still in prison, if they have been killed. So it's also very difficult to know what are the exact figures. So we have also the uncertainty about these persons, but also for the families. I mean, these families stay in limbo about what has happened to their relatives. They have no news. I know that ICRC is working hard, but they have opened, they call it opening a file. They are following only about 10,000 people. Also, I mean, arbitration and arbitrary detention, disappearance, harassment of people in areas that are now being retaken again by the Syrian government from the anti-government groups. They're all too common again, even if the government has signed a reconciliation agreement. People targeted are former opposition leaders, media activists, aid workers, defectors, but also relatives of activists, of former anti-government fighters, family members of persons who have left or fled Syria. We are very much in support and very much appreciate the work of the Special Envoy Geir Petersen, and we're ready to help him also when it comes to his work on detainees, abductees, and missing persons, which is one of his priorities. And we very much also, it's very much also an issue of high priority for the European action. And I know that he has designed also, or destined his deputy to follow this matter very closely. I know also that the Office of the Special Envoy is also present as an observer in the meetings of the Astana Working Group on detainees alongside with the ICRC. But so far there has only been an exchange of about 80 people on 3 occasions. I mean, if you look at this number and you compare it to the figures that I mentioned in the beginning, it's just a small drop in the ocean. So much more needs to be done, taking also into account the staggering scale of the whole issue. I think it's really appalling. Amongst those that are detained, the missing persons, many are women, political and civil activists, social activists, who are sometimes or often used as a tool of war. Some women were also taken as hostage owing to their relation with members of the opposition. And so today we will indeed hear more about these testimonies. Most women detained suffered psychological, physical, sexual, social violence, as well as also disavowment by their families and deprivation of their children. I would like to recall that last week we had the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, and that Mrs. Mogherini, together with Pramila Patten, who is the Special Representative of the Secretary General on elimination of sexual violence in conflict, have joined their forces to call on the international community to accelerate efforts to eliminate the scourge of all forms of sexual violence, including as a strategy and a tactic of war and terror. Sexual violence, indeed, in conflict constitutes a grave human rights violation with devastating physical, psychological and social consequences. The EU and the UN are working very closely together, and we are very much committed to further strengthen their work, our work in terms of prevention, protection, prosecution, as well as in terms of holistic support to help the survivors rebuild their lives and also their livelihoods within their families and communities. I think it's also key to continue working together to end impunity for perpetrators of all these kind of acts, and to guarantee also access to justice, to protection and reparation for the survivors. Their voices, their rights, their needs must guide us in our response to foster more equitable and peaceful societies. Indeed, we absolutely need accountability, and it must be indeed more systematic, and we need to do more about it, and we need to make it happen. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let the stories and the voices of the women of Syria that we will hear today, their testimonies of detention, harassment and ill treatment, be a strong incentive for us all to do much more for all those that are still suffering in detention, that are still struggling with the consequences of this detention, and for all the families that are still longing for news about their missing family members. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Stevens, oops, let me get my microphone. Ambassador Stevens, thank you for your wonderful speech and your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'd like to say I see members of civil society in the room, and it's good to see you all here in support and in attendance. Thank you. But also like to say that it's an honor to be here today, and I'm grateful to be sitting next to these wonderful panelists. Without your heroic work, we would not be able to do our job. So thank you for sharing these painful things that you're going to be talking about today. It's your heroic efforts to ensure that those who remain trapped in regime prisons are not forgotten. That's what inspires all of us to go out and do our jobs every day. As you know too well, the death toll in Syria continues to climb. Estimates exceed 500,000 Syrian lives lost because of the conflict. More than 5.6 million Syrians are refugees, 2/3 of whom are women and children. Another 6.2 million are internally displaced, many of whom have been displaced multiple times since 2011. Cities have been destroyed, families separated, lives shattered. Hundreds of thousands have been detained or disappeared. The people of Syria have suffered enormously. And as we've seen time and time again in conflict zones, Syrian women, increasingly breadwinners, heads of households, caretakers of young and old, and the psychic heart of their families and communities, they have often suffered the most. Now, the civil war in Syria did not begin with violence. It started when ordinary people made peaceful calls for freedom, human rights, and reform. In response, we have witnessed the regime and its backers target civilians with Russian airstrikes and Iranian-supported ground assaults. We have seen them cripple civilian infrastructure, local markets, schools, healthcare facilities destroyed, detaining men, women, children, medical and humanitarian staff, journalists, and others. Many have been subjected to torture and sexual and gender-based violence, inhumane conditions, denial of fair trials, and even death. Families of the disappeared are often left without any information on the fate of their loved ones. Women and children are increasingly forced to make ends meet as they wait, hoping that their husbands and fathers will return. And the regime continues to commit these heinous acts. The Syrian Network for Human Rights reports at least 1,478 cases of arbitrary arrest since the start of 2019 alone. This madness must end, and that's why we're here. Because we know that there will never be a lasting peace in Syria without tangible progress towards the release of arbitrarily detained Syrian civilians, particularly women, children, and the elderly. Studies show that the real or perceived abuses of women in regime prisons have contributed to the radicalization and recruitment of terrorist fighters for ISIS and other groups. The regime must also adhere to its obligations pertaining to humane treatment of all prisoners, including allowing access by independent monitors. And it must provide families greater access to information on the fate of their detained loved ones. Efforts to release detainees have stalled under the auspices of the so-called Astana guarantors, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. We've only seen a few token prisoner exchanges, as you were mentioning, Ambassador, and those were mostly combatants. We all know the vast majority of Syrian detainees are civilians whose only crime at all was to call for reform and change. That's why we continue to condemn abuses in prisons and call for access to detainees by international monitoring bodies in UN resolutions. We will do so again at the third committee, we'll do so again at the third, got to get that sentence right, we will do so again during UNGA third committee in the fall with the intent to increase the focus on detainees, as we're doing here at this panel. But words are not enough, and I think we all know that. This is why the United States and other like-minded countries strongly support the work of the UN Special Envoy, Geir Peterson, who has stated that addressing the plight of detainees is one of his main priorities. We must ensure that the detainee releases and improved access to prisons is included in political discussions aiming to resolve the conflict. It's also the reason that we continue to strongly support the documentation and investigation of abuses in detention centers across the country by the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on Syria, the IIIM, as well as Syrian organizations like the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center. We also recognize the importance of the work of the UN Independent International Commission on Inquiry, the COI, on Syria, which has reported thousands of cases, credible cases, of government authorities engaging in torture to punish perceived opponents. We look forward to their briefing next week. These organizations lay the foundation for the current and future justice processes, including criminal prosecutions. And we work to mitigate the suffering of those who survived Assad's torture cells and their families. These Syrians deserve support of the international community so that they have the opportunity to thrive, but barriers often impede their access to services, particularly for the women. According to the COI, sexual violence against women and girls at checkpoints is routine, limiting their freedom of movement. Other barriers to services include the fear of being stigmatized and ostracized, as well as distance to service delivery points and family restrictions. In response to increased accesses to services, my team launched the Syrian Survivors of Torture Initiative, SOTI, that through these Syrian organizations, SOTI could work to address the physical, psychosocial, and legal needs of Syrian survivors of torture, former political prisoners, and their families. But the scale of need is overwhelming. We would welcome greater collaboration through SOTI and other efforts to address the needs of survivors. With that, I'd like to conclude so that may we hear from our diverse panelists who represent the millions of Syrians impacted by the regime's horrific actions. I cannot emphasize enough how thankful I am for your courage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ambassadors. It's really a great opportunity to hear directly from the women themselves who have been brave and to document the atrocities that have been witnessed. And they are human rights defenders, frontliners, and also survivors. And we have this privilege to hear the stories from them. It's a great opportunity because they represent the missing voices of thousands of women and girls who have been silenced because of enforced disappearance, detention, and killings. They represent the voices of many civilian populations that have suffered because of the conflict in Syria. I am representing the working group on discrimination against women, and our working group recently issued a report on women deprived of liberty, which analyzes the underlying causes of deprivation of women's liberty. In the report, we have identified that one of the causes for deprivation of women's liberty is their exposure to violence and conflict. Conflict pushes women into disproportionate incarceration and detention and confinement by both state and non-state parties involved in conflicts. And this resonates with the Syrian experience. And we have also highlighted some of the information we have received concerning Syria and other African and Asian countries that are affected by conflict. And this, again, is very important to the work of our mandate. We have, thanks to these women and many other Syrians who are documenting the stories so that the international community, human rights mechanisms, and the whole world is aware of the sufferings of many women and children, men and boys, and all involved. We are gathered here to hear from them, so I don't want to take much of the time. We have these 4 brave women. One is Yasmeen Benshi, Sema Nassar, Yasmeen Mohammed, and Dania Yacoub. They will be telling us the stories. First will be Yasmeen Benshi, and second, Yasmeen Mohammed, third, Dania Yacoub, and the fourth will be Sema Nassar. I would not be interrupting them. They will go in this order. And just for the information, they will be speaking in Arabic, and we have Yasmeen in English. We have interpretation, and I'm also told that we have a Facebook Live, so others are also following us. They're all human rights defenders, as I said, but they will also introduce themselves the way they want to be introduced. So we will start from Yasmeen. That one. We have both Yasmeen. Okay.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Yasmeen Benshi from Latakia. I'm a human rights activist, a journalist, and a volunteer CEO at a local humanitarian organization. First, I would like to give you a brief background about my arrest. In 2013, I was arrested by the Syrian regime in a military security branch 215, which is called the branch of death. Then, in Adra prison for a year. The psychological torture I endured was unlike any traumatic experience I had lived through. I witnessed the abuse and actual murder of young children, men, and women. That image haunts me to this moment. Later, in 2014, I was released with another 24 women detainees in exchange for the Malula nuns at the Syrian-Lebanese border. I still remember when Sister Pelagia hugged me and told me, "I'm so happy that you are all free because of this exchange." We assure that exchanges are not the solution because we want a total solution, which is guaranteed by relevant international resolutions. After that, I was forced to flee from Syria to Turkey for safety, where I have been living and working until now. Actually, I want to tell you also about my brother's detention, who was arrested in 2012 by the Syrian regime due to his participation in a peaceful demonstration. I was not able to have any information about my little brother. 7 years later, my aunt received a certificate from the Syrian regime confirming the death of my sibling. The death of my sibling. I call upon the international community to put pressure on the Syrian regime to hand over the body of my brother and all bodies of the detainees who were killed under the torture. My young brother was like a son to me. I raised him and took care of him after our mother died. That was the most painful that ever happened to me. When my brother died, I knew that he is not the only one, but there are thousands like him. We should not forget and ever give up on calling for their release. So, I'm here today to raise my voice for him and all of my Syrian sisters and brothers who are paying a high price for the freedom and democracy that we are all here believe in. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Yasmeen Mohammed. English translation is on channel 2, please. English translation, channel 2. Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Yasmeen Mohammed. I'm a Syrian Kurd from Afrin. At the outset, and as the case of most Syrians, despite the feelings of depression, because we do not see any political solution, and since the international community is unable to do anything in view of the Syrian tragedy, especially with regards to the dossier of detainees, I have been determined to come here and to provide my testimony, especially since what is taking place in the detention places of the Assad regime and related militias who are their allies. Everybody knows the cases of torture, rape, death by famine, and the privation of health care, all these based on extrajudicial ruling that have nothing to do with justice. I was a university student, and I didn't have any direct relationship with politics. But because I was a Syrian, a Kurd from Afrin, my ambition and my dreams were to reduce the security grip and its interference in our private lives and our attempt to obtain our freedoms. On the day I was arrested, which was on the 14th of March 2013, and which lasted about 5 months, in the military security branch in Aleppo, my greatest concern at the time was the fate of my young sister, who had been arrested with me. The investigator exercised torture, oral or moral torture against me, and threatened me to rape her if I did not admit and acknowledge to him the information and confessions he wanted, and that moral torture was more difficult than any kind of bodily torture. However, and after a short time of my presence in the detention place, where I came to know closely the rest of the detainee women, I discovered that the case is greater than my fear for my younger sister. And because each of these detainee women had become like a sister to me, like a family to me, and I see myself in every woman, in every girl, Syrian girl or woman that was and still is in the detention places. I still remember my colleague Marah in the detention place, and Marah and her story are one of the main reasons that have pushed me to come here today. Marah had been exposed to coercion, and she had to subject herself to the sick sexual instincts of the investigator. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe Marah was raped many times and she had become a sexual slave and then she disappeared. Or should I be speaking to you about a group of children and minors that I had seen in the detention place, and I had heard that they had been raped repeatedly? By whom? By other military detainees who had refused to fire against civilians in peaceful demonstrations, and they found themselves in these detention places and were forced to rape children. They are all victims of dictatorship and oppression in my country. I just have to tell you that my accusation, or I was accused of having transferred medicines and food and children's milk for civilians, and therefore the sanction was that my life was destroyed as well as that of my family. I remember the pictures of Marah and other detainees and how we were all suffering from disease and famine. I have met women from Aleppo, from Kobani, Idlib and other places. Some have disappeared and no trace of them is left, and some others are still in detention places, as though those who have survived, and I being one of them, we still have wounds, deep wounds. I don't think that our lives will continue and our wounds will be healed, except if we manage to achieve the rule of law and achieve accountability through political transition for a sustainable peace in my country, through the implementation of international resolutions under the auspices of Geneva, and we have to solve the case of the detainees and not politicize it. Finally, I thank you your kind attention.
Good morning. I will be speaking in Arabic. I will try to slow down for the sake of interpretation. First, I would like to say that my name is Dania Yacoub. I have been born in Damascus. I now live in Hamburg, Germany, and I am the director of the Syrian German Association for Women. I was previously a human rights activist, defending human rights in Syria, including the rights of women and children. I have been detained 3 times by the Syrian regime. This detention was arbitrary, without any sentences, any judiciary proceedings. The dates of my detention will stay in my mind, rooted in my body and soul, not only because of the physical and psychological suffering I had to go through, but also because I have seen thousands of women that were detained. In the prison, subjected to systematic rape and torture. I have also seen massacres. The massacres of my Syrian citizens when I was in solitary confinement in cell number 21. One woman came to my cell. She has been arrested at a crossing point between Damascus and Eastern Ghouta. This woman has told me that children have suffocated to death because of toxic gases being thrown up, chemical attack on Eastern Ghouta. Death was following up everywhere in prison and detention. Thank you all. What is very painful for me is the fact that I have seen children, women, children detained with their mothers, some of them in solitary confinement underground without any possibility for a normal life, all in the dark. I have taken the hand of a child. I think his age was between 6 and 7. I remembered my son, so I tried to hug him and hold him in my arms. I thought that by doing so, I would hold in my hands and between my arms the future of Syria destroyed by Assad. I was being tortured and I was being summoned many times to the investigation room. And while going to my investigation rooms, I would see children under legal age that have been arrested and are detained with women in one room. They will be hanging from the wall like we used to be. They would do so that they get from us fake confessions. Some of the women have been obliged to sign on investigative reports, fake confessions that are prepared by investigators. And after hanging the woman from the wall, they will tell her, just sign here. I still have many dreams. My dream would be to get one day a PhD, the PhD thesis that I have been working on in Damascus University for 4 years before being obliged to leave it. During my first and second detention, I stayed in Damascus. I was adamant to stay. But after my third detention, I was afraid for the life of my child, my boy. So I left to Lebanon and then to Germany. Now I am in Hamburg and I got special protection. I still dream of a democratic country far from dictatorship. And I hope that I will be able one day to go back to Syria in a voluntary and safe return. Yet for that we have to stop all arbitrary detentions in areas where the swaps are happening. So I hope that all the prisoners and detainees will be fully released and that the fate and destiny of the enforced disappear will be known. I hope that you will make pressure on the regime so that they will give you the list of detainees they have, and thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Dania. I would like to thank all the women who had the courage to share with us a part of their testimonies and their life and this very difficult period of their life. My name is Sema Nassar. I work on documenting violence against women, arbitrary arrest and enforced disappearance in Syria since 2011. I am a co-founder of an organization that is working on this file with a number of volunteers, and I'm working now on a thesis from the London University for Economic and Political Studies on the transitional justice in Syria. It's been 8 years I've been working in this field, but yet despite all the suffering that you have heard today, yet this is really just a tip of the iceberg. It's just a tip of the iceberg, a part of the real truth that is happening in government detention centers and prisons, whether secret or not secret. And what is happening within these prisons, they go beyond their wall in order to touch upon the life of the families of detainees. All this makes the file of detainees a very important file, and this is why solving this issue is a part of the political solution in Syria. We cannot restrict this file to mere prisoner swaps, where prisoners of opinion are usually excluded. We cannot consider that prisoner swaps and exchanges are the best solution to go ahead. because this is basically what encouraged all the parties to conduct many operations of detention, including detaining women. Since the first prisoner swap, women have been arrested and detained as a weapon and a bargaining chip in Syria. This was also a pretext for people to start blackmailing others. And this has given some paramilitary forces present on the ground a pretext to detain women, because no one can say no to saving lives and detainees in prison. This is why they have accepted the prisoner swaps in the first place. But we cannot accept prisoner swaps as a part of the solution. If you know that the person that is a part of the prisoner swap is obliged to be deported, to leave the region to another region where he can also be subjected to other violations like it is happening. All the young girls that are a part of the prisoner swaps, they moved to Idlib, and there they are subjected to shelling, to deportation, so multiple violations. And prisoner exchanges exacerbate war in Syria, so they do not at all support peace. One of the ladies here said that the only solution is the immediate release of all detainees. This should be the case, and until we reach that stage, we have to release at least immediately all children that are detained in prisons, and all women that are detained in prisons and centers of detention, and all that have been detained before July 2012. And we have to freeze as well all the sentences that are being issued by exceptional and military courts. Those sentences that have even touched upon children. And you can go back to the report on forgotten children that documents the sentences that have been issued against children in Syria. And the report also talks about the refusal of the authorities to give back the bodies of those children, or to disclose the mass graves where they have been buried. These are some recommendations that I would like to submit to the international community. I am documenting this file, and I would like you to give us more support, and to give more support to NGOs that are working on detainees and their forced disappearances, and adopt a women-gender approach in their work. We would like to ask European countries as well to cover the possibility of judging the perpetrators in their countries. But this topic will be covered later on by another colleague. We have asked repeatedly to disclose the fate and destiny of detainees, and to give us at least the list of detainees. And what was really surprising and shocking is that in early 2019, the atrocities have even become worse. Those people that have been detained, they have seen their civil status change just like that abruptly. Sometimes the families would go to the civil status departments, and they will discover that their sons or daughters are dead. And if you see a person whose son or daughter is disappeared, has been enforced disappeared, the first advice that we would give to that person would be to go to the civil status department in Syria to check whether they are still alive or not. One father has been asking about his daughter, and then the officer told him, come back in 1 month. And he came back in 1 month, and he gave him this certificate of death of his daughter. This gives you an idea that these violations are repeatedly committed against Syrians. I have a lot to say, yet time is tight. And I think that in the past 8 years, we have talked a lot, we have written a lot of recommendations, and we have repeatedly asked for having specific sittings and sessions in the Security Council on the issue of detainees and enforced disappeared, like we are doing today. there should be, I think, a hearing, a sitting specifically dedicated to this case, yet to no avail. And here I would like to seize this opportunity to remind you that in May 2013, the Irish Nobel Prize winner, her name is a bit difficult to pronounce, but she visited Syria and she has asked for the release of 72 activists that are completely peaceful. And the Minister of the Justice at that time has promised her to look into the destiny of those people and to release them if they have them. Despite that, those people have not been released, including them I can cite Mazen Darwish, Yahya Sharbashi, and other of peaceful activists. They have high morals and they have really integrity, and they are committed to non-violence, and they refuse that weapon will be the solution for the future of Syria. They were only talking about political reforms and about social change. They were really believing in a society that is being ruled by human rights principles. At that time, 19 international organizations have signed a petition in order to ask for the release of these 72 activists and human rights defenders. Only 17 of them have been released, and 14 of them have been released recently from Dania prison when the prison was raided. We have so far 39 of them. Their whereabouts are still unknown. We do not even know what is their fate. This is just a sample of all the detained people in Syria. In Ornamo, we have documented the cases of detainees. We have 87,836 people, including 4,989 women, 330 children. And we think that there have been also thousands of women that have delivered their babies during detention in circumstances that have already been covered by my fellow speakers. Before holding a seminar or holding a conference will give us a brief feeling of hope that these people are not forgotten. But today, in 2019, we have a lot of conferences, a lot of seminars, and a lot of events that talk about detainees. And this month, a very important resolution has been taken by the Security Council saying that the priority has to be given to the issue of the missing during conflicts. But all of this has never been reflected positively on the fate of those detainees. I will conclude here by raising a question to all of you. After you heard what we had to say, you can ask yourself what you can do to contribute to this cause. What can you do yourself? We don't want this issue to be a bargaining chip used by countries to achieve their self-interest. I think it's high time to changing a bit the course that we have, to learn from our mistakes and to go beyond vested political interest. And it's time to ask today, what did we really do to contribute to this cause? Even though talking to our daughters and sons about what's happening in Syria and about this crime that is committed against Syrians every day. So I hope that every one of you will think as a human being before thinking as a decision maker or an influencer. Just think as a human being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmeen, Sema, Yasmeen, and Dania. It was not easy to, listening, but thank you so much for sharing such personal, emotional, and also painful stories that represent the lived realities of many women and girls in Syria. Thank you. I mean, I appreciate the brave ways that you told the stories. I'm sure everybody is touched by the stories, and also the imagination that many more have suffered the same and also more grave human rights violations. And now we have, it's also emotional for me. I'm sorry if I'm not coherent in the way I speak. We have some time for interactive discussion. I'm sure there are also some other women among us who would like to share the stories, their testimonies. So I will open the floor, and